John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 78, and just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. John is getting his mojo back after being depressed for a while from Kit leaving him and Chaz beating him up and saying that he doesn't want to be his friend anymore. And of course, a bunch of stuff happened from that, but basically, John was in a bad place. Now he is getting back to his old self. And as part of that, the first thing he did as he came back to England was he needed to make everything okay with Chaz, or at least try to. So he found Chaz in a bar, and he waited until all his friends left. Chaz was telling them a story about one of the many times he helped out John with not only getting around, but also helping him get rid of an evil spirit. And at the end of that story, as the pub was closing, and Chaz's friends were leaving, John revealed himself, and Chaz and John finally were able to make up. So now their friendship is finally repaired, at least enough so that they can get back to being friends, and I'm sure Chaz giving John rides everywhere. But that is where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, with issue 78, we see in the foreground John is really close to us. He's got an unlit cigarette in his hand, so he's probably about to light that, and he's looking like he's cocky as ever. In the middle ground, we see the spirit of what looks like a young girl. And I say spirit, but she does have a human body. She is naked, but there are wisps of light coming from her head that is whirling around her body and covering her up somewhat. And then behind her in the background, we see the eyes of the First of the Fallen just staring out at us. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Garth Ennis with art by Steve Dillon. And as we turn to the first page, we get a very interesting one. It is a completely black page that has little flecks of dust or something like that floating down. And we see the name of this issue is called Rake at the Gates of Hell, Part 1. And there's a bit of foreboding narration that says, "If anyone wants to pray for him, now's the time." And as we turn the page, we see John and Heather sitting at a bus stop, and it is nighttime, and we get a couple silent panels as we get closer to them, and we see John is lighting 2 cigarettes. He's giving one to Heather, who, if you don't remember, is his Scottish friend. Now, I will say, Heather has a very strong accent in this issue, so I'm not going to read it as it is because it's really hard for me to do that accent. So I'm just going to read it and try to translate it in the voice that I've been doing him in, and maybe doing a little bit of the Scottish accent every now and then if it fits. So as John passes Heather the cigarette, we do see John looks kind of sad, Heather looks kind of sad, they're both kind of quiet, and as Heather puffs on the cigarette, he breaks the silence saying, "I never told you much about what I got up to in the Falklands, did I?" And John looks over and says, "No, mate." And Heather continues, I know you're not much of one for war stories. I just remembered this one, though. We've just made it up to the top of Mount Lungdon, right? Argies are surrendering left, right, and center. And screw me if right in the center of them, there's not these 4 Yank mercenaries. So we take 'em prisoner, and the sergeant radios this wee development in, and we wait for orders. I heard later that this came from the top. From London, you ken? But about a half hour later, we get a message from the CO. Shoot them. And as Heather is saying this, we're getting like a really extreme close-up on his face. He is wearing sunglasses at night, so we can't see his eyes. But we can tell from his posture and the way he's kind of quietly telling the story that this is going to be a very heavy conversation. And that is confirmed as we turn the page and we zoom out from the extreme close-up on Heather's glasses to see the front of his face where we can see he's bleeding from the mouth. And he continues, I'm not making excuses here, right? But we'd already had the shite kicked out of us at Goose Green. We lost Colonel H there. And Christ, you don't give much of a frig about the Geneva Convention when you've just had your best pal's head blown all over you. So I said I'd do it. So we get these arseholes on their knees, Let me plug the first 3. And then Header pauses as if to wince in pain, it seems, and then he reaches up and he touches the blood that's coming from his mouth. Then he steadies himself and continues. Not a worry about it either. I was a bit of a mad bastard in them days. And anyway, here's these bloody cowboys have signed up with the RGs to shoot at us. So frig the lot of them. So then I get to the last one, and I stick the muzzle between his eyes. And he looks up the SLR at me. No screaming or begging or nothing. Just this awful sad wee look. Like he knew it was all over, and he was so disappointed. Well, after that, we stuck phosphorus grenades up their arses and frags in their grubs, and you'd never have known they were there in the first place. But I could never get over that look on his face, you can? And in most of these panels, we're looking at Header's face, but in the last couple, we cut to John as well, and he's looking super sad, and his eyes are closed, and he actually begins to cry. And Header continues, saying, I tell you what, though, Johnny, I think I can. Exactly how the poor bastard felt right now. I should have stayed fit when I came at the old Paris, so I should. If I wasn't such a fat bastard, I could have been out the door before the dickhead with the shotgun could blink. Shite. Then we see John wipe the tear away from his face, and Header stops moving, and John reaches over and takes the cigarette out of his mouth, and Header still doesn't move. Then John stands up and walks away from the bus stop, and then we get one final panel on this page of a zoomed out shot of Header finally, where we see he has a shotgun blast to the chest. So that story was actually his dying words to John, and again in the series we get another one of John's friends dying. Then as we turn the page, we cut to later that morning, where John is in someone's house, and he's on the phone talking to someone saying, I'm sorry, mate. We went into the Caligula Club for those pages. Header was tooled up, just in case. We must have tripped an alarm or something. I mean, I got the stuff all right, but they were down on us like a ton of bricks. Header tried shooting it out with them, and yeah. I'm sorry, Rick. Yeah, I know. But, okay, look, I've got no right to ask you this, but can you phone his missus for us? I don't think Cheers. You too, mate. See ya. So John was talking to his friend Rick the Vic, who was also friends with Header, and he was giving Rick the bad news about what happened earlier this morning. Then as John turns around, we see that he's actually standing in a bedroom, and there's a black woman sleeping in the bed, and he walks over to her and asks, You awake? Then we see her open her eyes and say, And as John undoes his tie and unbuttons his shirt, he says, Good. Then we turn the page, and we see Rick the Vic is hanging up the phone, and of course he looks super sad because he just heard his friend Header died, so he decides to not go back to bed after getting that news, and he gets dressed in his priest clothes, and he goes to his church, and he kneels down in front of the cross, and he begins to pray. Then as we turn the page, we cut away from that scene to a page that is completely white except for one figure, who is the first of the fallen, and he's just floating in this white space, and he says, shit. And there is panels on these pages, but they're all of him floating in this white dimension. So over the first panel, we get narration that says, He comes to limbo to think. He had wanted to make his plans that would shake creation, that would cause the slaughter of millions of innocents and damned, that would entangle even his accursed brothers. But he couldn't come up with a single thing, because there was nothing to come up with. There was no way out. Neither he nor the other two would relinquish their claims to Constantine, and with no chance of defeating them, he was back at square one. It just wasn't fair. But then, nobody said life was going to be fair, and he knew that better than anyone. Then he says out loud again, shit, shit, shit. Then from behind the first, we hear someone say, My Lord Satan. And the first turns, and as we turn the page, we see a little girl floating behind him. She has very long blonde hair, and she is naked except for a piece of cloth around her midsection, and she's missing most of her right arm. And also, she has very weird eyes. They look kind of like the eyes of a fly, except they're inside of a human's eye socket. And as the first of the fallen turns towards her, she continues saying, My Lord Satan, first among them who fell, King of the Inferno, I humbly greet you and beg your gracious indulgence. But the first doesn't seem very happy about this. He says, Oh, you come walking up here like you own this place. You disturb my most private meditations, and you beg my gracious indulgence. You're in for an extreme sobering next 5 minutes, little demoness. And who are you anyway? And the little demoness replies, I am not long a demoness, Lord Satan. It is but 16 years since I first entered hell, at the hands of the mortal whose soul you so desire. My hatred of Constantine is second only to yours, my lord. My name was Astra. And right there, we get a bit of a deep cut back to the Jamie Delano run. It seems this demoness is the little girl named Astra from issue 11 of Hellblazer, where John stupidly in his youth used magics inappropriately and ended up getting this little girl named Astra's soul taken to hell by the demon named Nergal. And of course, as the first of the fallen hears her name, he knows who she is, and he has a very evil, intrigued look on his face. And he says to her, I thought Nergal kept you as a toothpick, Star Child. I had no idea he had raised you to demonhood, and after so short of a time. It's unheard of. And Astra replies, We were lovers. Well, he did the loving. I took the power he gave me gladly. The joys that hell offers eclipse the ones I knew on earth, and then some. I was glad when you chastised him as you did, my lord. For all his bluster, Nergal was a buffoon. And the first of the fallen replies, He caught me on a bad day. I don't know. I've always liked pulling people's arms off and then watching them try to get by. It beats evisceration any time, though I need hardly point that out to you. And in this panel, Steve Dillon made sure we got a good look at her arm that is missing. And Astra replies, That was just a fraction of the agony Constantine caused me. That's why I hate him so. And that is why I have devised a plan to break the deadlock you and your brothers labor under, so I may see you take your revenge upon him. May I outline my scheme? And the first of the fallen smiles an evil smile, and he says, Is the Pope Catholic? Then as we turn the page, we cut to John and Chaz, and they are in traffic as Chaz is driving John somewhere. And Chaz is saying, So why do we have to go down there anyway? And John replies, A mate of mine squatting in a high-rise in Tower Hamlets. I need a word. And Chaz replies, What, seriously? I mean, didn't you hear? Where have you been for the past year anyway? And not really wanting to get into everything that John went to for the past year, he says, Down. And Chaz was expecting a little bit more, but he says, Yeah, well, the BNP have only got a council seat there, haven't they? There's been marches and everything. A lot of bad blood at the moment, you know what I mean? And John looks kind of serious and says, The British National Party? Ah, shit. Sarah was trying to tell me something about that the other night, but I was hardly bleeding listening. Then Chaz says, She's a nice girl, she is. You want to look after her. But it seems like John isn't really thinking of Sarah as a long-term thing, so he says, Oh, bollocks, Chaz. One more disaster waiting to happen. But as he says this, he looks out the passenger window and he sees a woman across the street and he recognizes her. And Chaz notices that John is following her with his eyes as they pass by her. He asks, What's the matter? And John answers, One of the hookers outside Waterloo there, she looked like this girl from Dundee I used to go out with. Nah, it couldn't have been. And Chaz chastisingly says, Yeah, well, you should be thinking more about the one you're going out with at the minute, chum. And John is sick of Chaz telling him what to do, so he says, Look, I had a bleeding rough time of it last night, so leave it out, will you? And Chaz looks over kind of mad and says, Excuse me for breathing. And then there's a bit of an awkward silence because obviously they've just made up from a big fight they had over a year ago, and they don't want to start fighting again immediately. So John, who's still thinking about the girl, says, Sod it, Chaz. It was her. Let us out here, will you? Come on. But before Chaz can even stop the car, John gets out, and Chaz yells, Friggin' hell, hold on. But John's not listening. He just takes off running back to the girl that he saw. And as he does this, his narration says, Can't be, can it? Can't be her. She was a fiery little thing, sharp as they come. Could handle anyone. This girl? Jesus. She looked ready to drive under a bus. So when John gets back to the spot he saw the woman, he sees her again, and she's leaning into a car window, and he's sure it's her now. So he rushes over, and he gets between her and the car window, and he yells at the John inside, Sling your hook, arsehole. Find someone else to suck on your toes, or I'll have you all over the front pages. Piss off. And of course, this scares the guy away, so he drives off quickly, and the woman is left staring at John, and John looks at her and says, Bloody hell. Helen? And I should describe Helen before we go any further. She is a white woman with black hair down to her shoulders, and she has really big bangs. And she's wearing a purple tube top and black leather skirt with a red jacket, and she has fishnet stockings on and high heels. So as John says her name, she looks up dazed and says, And then she sees his face and she says, Johnny? Johnny? Oh, Johnny, I'm such a mess. And then she falls forward into him and he catches her. And then she looks up at him and says, I mean, French is a tenor. And John's confused and he says, what? And I think she kind of forgot who she was talking to for a second, because she then looks up and says, oh, I'm sorry. I'm not making much sense. Oh, dear. I spent all my money on smack, Johnny. He puts it through my eyelids because he says it works quicker. And John looks at her and says, Who? And then she looks past John and says, Phil. He sells it to me cheap because I work for him. Hi, Phil. And then behind John, we hear Phil say, what you looking at? And as John turns to look at Phil, he sees a white man in his mid-30s who's trying to look very tough. He's got reddish brown hair that's pulled back in a ponytail with a stubbly mustache and a little goatee. And he's wearing a bright yellow suit jacket over a pink shirt and brown slacks. And of course, John's not intimidated by this guy. He looks kind of stupid. And Helen says to John, this is Phil, Johnny. He's awfully good to me, so he is. And then Phil says to her, shut your mouth, right? And then he turns to John and says, what you want with her, bollocks? You want a blowjob? Friggin' pay her and go down to the bogs with her, right? But John doesn't reply immediately, so Phil yells, I'm talking to you, right? And the whole time Phil is talking, John is looking at him with disgust. So the second Phil stops yelling at him, John just yells, bastard! And he takes a swing at Phil. And unfortunately for John, it seems maybe Phil was expecting this, because Phil is able to dodge John's strike. And then before John can recover, Phil karate chops John in the throat. And then Phil does a side kick and hits John in the stomach. So it seems that Phil knows some sort of martial arts. And while this is happening, Helen is watching in her heroin-induced state, and she's saying, oh dear. And as John falls to the ground from the kick, Phil gets on top of him. It looks like Phil is about to poke out John's eyes with his hand, and he yells, wanker! Friggin' wanker! You're bloody dead! But before Phil can do anything else, all of a sudden he is struck in the face with a crowbar. And it looks very painful because we can see his lip is split immediately. And then immediately after the crowbar, we see Chaz walk in and kick Phil in the stomach. And he says to Phil, you think you're bleeding, Bruce Lee? Stay down! Stay down! And as Chaz continues to beat Phil on the ground, John is able to stand up. And of course he's rubbing his throat and he tells Helen, come on. And Helen, who's still in her heroin days, says, does Phil say it's all right? And as John takes her hand and pulls her away, he says, uh-huh. And it's funny, as they walk away, we can't really see what Chaz is doing to Phil, but there are a bunch of people turning around and looking at it with horror on their face. And then we hear Chaz say, are you freaking deaf or what? Because I guess Phil tried to get up off the ground after Chaz told him to stay down. And then we hear more screams coming from Phil. So as John gets back to where Chaz parked the car, Helen looks up at John and says, where are we going? But John doesn't look at her. He looks back at Chaz and says, Chaz! And Chaz hears John, so he stops beating up Phil, and as he walks away, we see Phil, whose face is completely bloody and bruised, look up at Chaz and yell, I fucking get you! I get you, bitch! Who fucking listen to me? I'll fucking get you! But Chaz isn't scared of Phil, and he just flips him off. And as everybody gets in Chaz's car, Chaz says to John, bloody old Bill will be here any minute. Where to? And John replies, my gaff. Need to stop at a phone first. And Chaz says, right. Then he jokingly says to John, you practically had him there. I was in two minds whether or not to just let you finish him off yourself. And John jokes back, who cracks the jokes around here, me or you? Then we cut to John at a payphone, and he's talking to someone on the phone saying, yeah, I'm sorry about this morning. Yeah, Sarah, look, I need a bit of a favor. You know your sister, the one that's a nurse? Yeah, I know that. I know you could just walk out on me, but I'm asking you to help me instead, okay? Then we see John light a cigarette, and he pulls the phone receiver away from his ear because, assumingly, she's yelling at him. Then we cut into the car where we see Chaz is talking to Helen, and he's lighting a cigarette for her, and she says, thanks. Do you think we can go back to Phil soon? He's got the gear, you know, and I think I need some. And Chaz is kind of confused, and he says, back to, well, maybe John's got what you need, love. And as he puts a cigarette in her mouth, she says, oh, well, I don't know. I think I should see Phil. But just then, John actually gets back into the car, And Chaz looks up at him and asks, right? And John replies, sorted. So it seems even if Sarah was mad at him, apparently her sister is going to help Helen out. And as John gets in the car next to Helen, she asks him, was it Phil you spoke to? And as we turn to the page, we cut to someone we haven't seen for a while. It is George, the brother of John's friend Dez, who was murdered by white nationalists a couple story arcs back. And he looks a lot different now. He definitely looks older and tougher and more muscular. And instead of his short dreadlocks, he has a shaved head now. And he's standing in his room in his house, and we can see he's got posters for gangster rappers. So we see a poster for Ice-T. We see a Straight Outta Compton poster. So it seems he's got a lot harder since his brother was murdered. And if you remember, he was the one who murdered the white nationalist guy that killed his brother. In case you don't remember, he did shoot that man with a shotgun, and it was kind of left hanging whether he was going to be arrested or what was going to happen with that. So as George stands in his room looking at a picture of his brother Dez and him, his mom comes in his room and says, George, what have you been up to? And we see behind her there are two white men, and they don't look like anything special, like officers or anything, but the mom says to George as the two men walk in, they have a search warrant for our house, George. What have you been doing? And at first George is just talking to his mom saying, Mom, for God's sake. But then he sees the men walk into his room and just start looking through his stuff, and he yells at them, Oi, piss off out of it. And like I said, these two white men are not wearing any uniforms or anything. They're just wearing regular suits with no insignia or badges or anything. As George yells at them, one of them turns and says, George Ridley, I'm Detective Constable Kenfield. This is my colleague, Constable Shaw. We have reason to believe you are dealing in cannabis resin. And George yells, bollocks! Then Detective Shaw opens a box and says, bingo. And he pulls out a little baggie of something. I'm assuming it's drugs. But it's literally like small enough to fit on his finger. So it's definitely not enough to deal drugs to someone. And as George sees Shaw pull this out, he says, piss off. You can't do me for dealing with that. There's not even a freaking eighth there. But the cops don't care. Constable Kenfield immediately moves to arrest George, and so he puts George's hand behind his back. And as they do this, George's mom is saying, oh, George, what would your brother have thought? Don't you care about Desmond's memory? And George looks up at her and says, this is bullshit. They're freaking stitching me up, Mom. It's not for the sod and smoke. They saw me up on the anti-Nazi march with their freaking cameras, and they're stitching me up. So the policemen begin forcibly pushing George out of the room, and his room is on the second floor of this house. So as they approach the stairs, we can see George is fighting them, and he's not going easy. And it seems like the mom actually believes what George told her. So she's trying to get clarification, and she's running behind them yelling, what do you mean? Wait a minute, please. But Constable Kenfield says, Miss Ridley, you've been very cooperative, but I must ask you to leave him to us. But she doesn't listen to him. She moves in front of them, in between them and the stairs, and actually puts her hands on Detective Shaw, just to stop him from moving forward. And she yells out, no, leave him. You're taking my boy. But Detective Shaw just shoves her back and yells, stupid black bitch. And that shove sends George's mom flying down the stairs, and she tumbles down, and when she comes to a stop, we see that her neck is broken and she is dead. And the look on George's face is, of course, of surprise and shock and horror. And Detective Kenfield looks the same, but Detective Shaw, the man who pushed her, has an evil look on his face. He looks kind of happy, and he says to his partner, shit, well, I mean, people trip all the time. Our word against Sambo's, isn't it? If you haven't caught on by now, obviously, Detective Shaw is super racist, and it seems like Detective Kenfield isn't on the same page as him, because he says, you what? And George takes this moment to act. He is able to break free of Kenfield's grip, and he runs into his room, and as Kenfield yells, get back here, you! We see George go to his bed and get something from it, and as Kenfield comes through the door, George grabs him by the neck and then lifts up a double-barrel shotgun and one-handed shoots Detective Shaw. And unfortunately, he only hits Shaw on the shoulder, but this causes Shaw to fly backwards, and there just so happens to be a window there, and he crashes through the second-story window and falls down onto a wall next to the street below. And this looks like it hurts a lot. Basically, the wall, which is made of brick, seems to have some kind of glass or something pointy on top of it. I think it's maybe so pigeons don't sit on it. And he lands on all that sharp stuff in the middle of his back, so hopefully he is at least paralyzed. And as he screams out in pain, we cut back into the house, and George is now pointing the shotgun at Detective Kenfield. And he says, you! And a very terrified Kenfield says, bollocks, You fired both. And then George pushes the shotgun into his throat and says, Did I? But he doesn't pull the trigger. He just looks Kenfield in the eyes and says, I see you follow me out this door. I'll do you. So frickin' help me God. And the last panel on this page is Detective Shaw screaming out for help as he bleeds out onto the wall below him. Then we cut to Sarah's house, who is the girl that John has been seeing. We actually saw her earlier in this comic. She was the black woman sleeping in the bed when he got home after Heather died. And John and her are kind of leaning against the wall out of the way as Sarah's sister examines Helen on the bed. And Helen is asking her, Is Phil coming? But the sister doesn't answer her. She just says, Hold still a minute, love. But Helen is desperate and she asks again, Is he? Then we cut to John and Sarah, who are a little bit further away from them, leaning against the wall. And Sarah says to John, You've got some nerve expecting us to help that tart. And John replies, She's not a tart, all right. She's just a sick woman who needs help. And then Sarah fires back, Same thing to you, isn't it? Doesn't matter what you call us as long as we're good for a quick screw. And she's saying this because she's still mad about this morning. If you didn't catch it, after John got back this morning from Heather being killed and after getting off the phone with Rick, he woke her up and he began to undress, so we can assume that he had sex with her and then immediately left to go meet up with Chaz. So she is very cross at him for that, and he looks at her and says, Look, I was an asshole this morning. I'm sorry. But Sarah's sister interrupts them and says, This woman's body is a mess. You're talking malnutrition for starters, and that eye's infected. We've got to get her to a hospital now. And John looks at her and says, No can do. And the sister angrily says, Excuse me? And John replies, The hospital will get her on a methadone program for that smack. And that means cops. And all that bastard of a pimp has to do is go around to the casualty departments asking for her. Can't you treat her here? But the sister doesn't back down. She looks at John right in the eyes and says, No way. God, you must be joking. She needs an IV. All kinds of drugs. And she's like listing them on her fingers. But John cuts her off saying, I can get you whatever you need. Look, if that bloke gets his hands on her, he'll kill her, right? Please, Lucy, please. And it seems like maybe this pleading has worked because Lucy says, Jesus, I don't know about this. Look, I've got a friend who's a doctor. I could ask her to have a look at her, but I'm not going to promise anything. And I mean, come on. What about the heroin? She's going to go cold turkey any time now. She's in for a hell of a rough night. This won't work at all. But John cuts in saying, I'll help her with it. I've done it before. Just tell Chaz what you need and phone your pal, all right? And then we hear Helen say, Johnny, please get Phil for me, will you? Come on. I'm starting to get really scared. But John puts a fake smile on his face and he walks over to her and says, What are you scared for? Come on, love. Chin up. You're going to be fine. And then he gives her a big hug. Then we get a panel of Lucy looking very touched by this moment and Sarah looking very angry at this moment. But the next panel is John looking back at her pleading. And then we cut to the sisters walking away from Chaz because apparently they've gone along with John's plan. And as they walk, Lucy jokingly says, Why do you get all the nice men, sis? And Sarah angrily says, Don't start. Then we cut back to the house where we see John is sitting on the bed with Helen holding her in his arms as she detoxes from the heroin. And as he does this, he looks super sad and his narration says, She ran out of words an hour ago. Just a whine now, like the noise life makes when it hasn't got the energy to stay. Christ, I hope she's strong enough. After this, it starts getting nasty. She's had it about as good as it gets. And then he looks down at her and his narration continues saying, What in frig's name am I doing? I saw one of my oldest mates get blown away last night. Today I got the shit beaten out of me in front of Waterloo. I'm seeing a woman I should have warned away the morning after the night before. And now I'm scrabbling in a junkie's soul and hoping the laughing little spitfire she used to be is still in there somewhere. Except, what if all I'm doing is getting her to stand beside me on the edge of a cliff? I need to stop getting distracted and get on with it. Find the snob, call Nigel, get things moving before that bastard down below gets me first. I need to take better care of me mates, to make sure Helen's okay, to be straight with Sarah, to wise up. Then we cut to Hell, and we see the first of the fallen, and he's standing looking at a sunset, and he's being rubbed all over his body by 3 female marionettes who are made from mannequins, it looks like. And the mannequins are human-sized, so they are like pretty big marionettes. So I'm assuming these are some sort of demon that we haven't seen before. And as they rub on him, the first of the fallen says, "Send a letter to each of my brothers, the second and the third of the fallen, the equal and opposite points of the triarchy. Tell them their brother wishes to meet them in the neutral territory of Limbo, and that I have formulated a solution to the problem of John Constantine and look forward to reaping the benefits along with my beloved kinsman. After that, you can open the champagne." And one of the marionettes says, "The Don Perignon, Lord Satan?" And the first thinks about this for a second, and then he says, "Why the hell not?" And in the last panel of this comic, he is standing naked looking at the sun now, and the marionettes are on their knees in front of him, and they look like they're reaching for his groin. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. What a weird way to end it, but it seems like Garth Ennis is setting up a lot of stuff for his last story arc, but we'll have to wait until next issue to see how it continues. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.